All right, folks, hello and welcome back to online English class. I hope you guys are doing well today. So today we're going to be finishing up some thoughts about OTN 4, looking at part 2, chapters 1 through 3, just a quick review and re-articulation of the main ideas developed in that lecture, because that content can be, it's easy to either overcomplicate or oversimplify what happens in those three chapters. So I want to return to them, and then we're going to start our SQ3R for part 2, chapters 4 through 8, which we'll be analyzing in the latter part of this week. Okay, before we do that, let's just return to the top of the week announcements. Remember your discussion grade procedures. All right, make sure you're leaving a thoughtful question, a concise summary, or a meaningful reflection on what was discussed. All right, aside from that, you need to make sure that you are continuing to read part 2 of 1984, completing that by next Monday, and then completing your OTNs as we complete them in class. Obviously, we completed OTN 4 yesterday. We're going to recap that, go back to that, double tap that today. But you need to be completing that and then beginning OTN 5 today as well. All right. Now, contextualizing all this is your work on the quarter 4 essay. If you need a prompt to the quarter 4 essay, please don't email me asking for the prompt. It is available on RenWeb. All right. So I make it available every single day. If you don't know how to download an attachment from RenWeb, they're available on the Lesson Plans tab, and you should figure it out. All right. You need to click around on RenWeb until you figure out where they are. All right, don't just log on and it's not staring you in the face right when you get on there, screaming, "Hey, here I am!" All right, and you get off and say, "Well, I couldn't find it." Okay, well, obviously you're going to need to look for it. Okay, it is definitely there. So make sure that you get online and download that. All right, so let's go ahead and jump back into OTN 4. Part 2, chapters 1 through 3, and just recap the main ideas that are articulated, all right, by the development of Winston and Julia's relationship in this section of the narrative. Okay, so if you found what we talked about yesterday to be confusing or complex, let me just kind of attempt to simplify that today in just a couple paragraphs of thinking, okay? Really, the concepts are pretty simple, and they are concepts that are at the core of what it means to be free, okay? So freedom is a concept that is obviously Orwell is meditating on here as Winston attempts to obtain freedom from his totalitarian, authoritarian environment, right? Part of what this novel is about is what it means to be free, what it means to be a free human being. And you live in a society, all right, the United States of America, which is a liberal, democratic society, all right, that would value, all right, liberty, right? I would venture to guess that if I said, "Hey, what does it mean to be an American? What do Americans value?" I bet the first thing that you would say, and typically the first thing that people say, is liberty or freedom. Well, the freedom to do what? The freedom to be how? What does it mean to be free on its most basic level? Well, part of what this whole novel is exploring is what it means to be free, okay? What it means to be a free human being, all right? Well, Winston in part 1 already established, right, what it means to be internally free. That is to say, to have a free mind and a free heart, to be able to set one's affections on what an individual deems worthy of love, deems to be the good, to be able to think rational thoughts that reflect the reality, all right, that is manifest in the world around them, and to make accurate records of those things, okay, and to pass those records down from generation to generation, allowing human beings to share, all right, in an ongoing discourse of rational reflection about what is true, to reevaluate those beliefs in light of new, updated, improved observations of reality, and using those observations to develop a worldview that is reliable, that is an authentic representation of both what is true and also what is good. All right, that is kind of the human endeavor, right? To know what is true and to pursue what is good. All right, a free individual is able to do so. Now, in part 1, Winston begins to be able to do that internally. But like all human beings, as we discussed yesterday, wants to develop an external life that reflects his internal value system. His relationship with Julia is an attempt to do so. Okay? And basically, right, he is externalizing that internal liberty that he has tried so hard to develop, to free his mind and his heart from the party. Okay? So, basically what's happening in part 2 is Winston's rebellion is, a good word for it, is intensifying, all right, because it is being shared. It is being externalized, all right, which is to say it's going from being something that is just for Winston or just experienced by Winston to something that is experienced socially or relationally, okay? It's become external. And his relationship with Julia is not just rebellious, but it's also a specific brand of rebellion that is the most antithetical to the party's dictates, and that is that it is based on love. And that's an ideal that binds people together, right? Love brings people together, just as hate rips people apart, all right? In violent kinds of relationships, love brings people together in mutually affirming and life-pursuing ways, all right? In self-sacrificial, devoted, and delight-filled ways. When we say that we love something, we mean, right, that we're willing to sacrifice our time, our effort, our lives even for it, right? So think about the way that a parent would love a child, right? They sacrifice their time, they sacrifice their money, they sacrifice their sleep in order to care for that child, right? Think about the way that a parent is devoted to the well-being of their child, right? They spend their lives bringing that child up, and think about the delight that is also implied by love. It is not just devotion, and it's not just sacrifice, all right? That would be something that we call duty, but it's something that also has this extra component of delight. It is it's something, loving another person, right, is something that implies a delight in them. Loving a thing, right, loving a book, it implies that you delight in it, right? You don't just devote your time in it. Like, for example, if you are forced to read this book and you're not enjoying it, you don't love it, right? You might still be devoting your time to it, and you might still be sacrificing other things that you might want to do because you have to read that book, but you don't delight in it. So you don't love it, right? You're doing your duty, but you don't love it, right? I love this book. I delight in it, right? I like talking about it. Okay, so when we come together using this sort of concept of love, all right, it expresses the fact that Julia and Winston are coming together and developing a relationship that is antithetical to the party's command to only love it. All right, but rather, right, they are rebelling against the party by loving one another. Okay, loving one another, which brings them together. It threatens the party's control over their society as they, in a very small way, develop a relationship that threatens the party's control externally, outwardly. Okay, so secondly, right, Winston and Julia, as they express their love for one another in the second chapter of part 2, in which Winston and Julia go to the Golden Country, all right, and they make love and they spend some time together, right, and they hang out. And they eat good food, right? They're rejecting the party's command to ignore the observations of their senses and to take pleasure or to delight in, right, to love only the party. As Winston and Julia take pleasure in one another's companionship and experience, all right, in their senses, all right, we experience the goodness of rightly ordered pleasure. All right, so they're not out there like doing meth. They're not out there experiencing a kind of pleasure that is wrongly ordered. All right, now as a Christian, you might say, well, they're not married and they're having sex. That's wrongly ordered. That's not rightly ordered pleasure. Okay, that is true. But once again, we have to focus on what Orwell is trying to communicate in the dystopia. Okay, so Winston and Julia, as they experience the goodness of those rightly ordered pleasures that lead to life, as they are in the golden country and they are experiencing this kind of flourishing environment, right? That is well ordered, beautiful, lively. They celebrate that beauty. They enjoy the thrush's song, all right? And it puts them in harmony with what they were made to do and what they were made to be, right? They are being human, all right? And when they are being human, when they're doing the things they were made to do, right, they know that it's good. They understand that it's pleasant, all right? And as they do that, as they construct that notion of the good for themselves, they're engaging in this distinctly human and distinctly free act of pursuing a blessed or good life, the pleasant life, according to their own sense of the good, instead of, right, rejecting the evidence of their senses and saying, despite the fact that this seems to be what I was made for and seems to be what I was made to do, I, because the party tells me to, will take pleasure and delight only in the party, and I will forget that I forgot that I was created to do and be distinctly human, right, and to pursue the good according to my own notion of the good, okay? In other words, right, Julia and Winston here, as they take pleasure in one another and express their love for one another, are expressing their freedom, okay? The party is obviously the enemy of freedom. Okay, and not only is that freedom internal, right, but it is being incarnated or externalized and shared. Okay, that is one of the reasons why Winston and Julia's relationship is so important in the process of Winston's rebellion. All right, so that concludes Act 4, OTN 4, which analyzes Part 2. Chapters 1 through 3. All right, this is a quick review of the basic main ideas communicated yesterday. All right, so let's go ahead and jump quickly through our OTN 5 SQ3R. All right, so in preparation for our analysis of chapters 4 through 8, we just want to quickly remind ourselves of some basic things about the text, right? Who's our speaker? Well, we already know. It's the third-person omniscient narrator. What's the genre and style? Well, we already know that as well. It's dystopian fiction. But just to kind of give us an update on where we're at in terms of the dystopia and Orwell's development of his dystopian world, right? Well, after Part 1, okay, which illustrates the nature of the dystopian environment in which Winston lives, which seeks to control Winston's external and internal lives completely, right? In other words, to restrict his freedom, to restrict all of his liberty, both internal and external, to restrict his ability to believe, his ability to love, his ability to know. All of those things are attempted to be, are the party attempts to restrict. And Winston, right, in Part 1, rebels against that totalitarian control. In the beginning of Part 2, as we just studied, that rebellion becomes increasingly outward as he externalizes his thought crimes, as he manifests his unorthodox value system, in a word, as he attempts to make his life match his values, right? So what is the title of this section of text? Well, it's just Part 2, chapters 4 through 8. This is the next phase of the rising action of the plot, where Winston's rebellion is going to become increasingly bold and increasingly external. Okay, so following that pattern established in the beginning of Part 2, Winston's rebellion is going to grow increasingly social. All right, and that's obviously going to come to its sort of height with his relationship with O'Brien and the brotherhood, a community or a group of brothers, a brotherhood that actively fights against the control of the party. Okay? So what happens in this section of text? Well, first, Winston rents Mr. Charrington's room. So Mr. Charrington's the guy that Winston bought the glass paperweight from, and also the guy who Winston bought his journal from. Okay, there in Mr. Charrington's room, he and Julia are going to continue their love affair. Okay, and so this is an increasingly bold move, and Winston's pretty convinced that he's going to get caught. All right, but he's willing to risk his life, to sacrifice his life and his well-being, all right, his outward freedom, in order to continue to pursue this inward, these kinds of inward freedoms, all right, that he has learned. He's willing to risk. He's willing to sacrifice his life in order to express his love for Julia. All right. Outside, he listens to a working class woman, one of the proles, singing a song as she works and reflects on its beauty, okay, alluding to Wordsworth's Solitary Reaper, okay. Winston, during this sort of scene, is longs to have a kind of normal married life with Julia, all right. Then Julia shows up to the room. She brings some delicious food. They hang out together. And then a rat shows up, and Winston reveals his deep hatred for rats, something you should keep in mind through the course of the novel. Winston hates and fears rats. All right, in the next chapter, Winston describes, or the narrator describes, Winston's thoughts about the city's consumption with preparations for Hate Week, which is a week-long sort of celebration of patriotic party members' love of Big Brother and hatred of all of his enemies. All right, Winston, again, continues to dream of being able to marry Julia and to live a normal life. He even considers changing his identity to be a prole, which he probably wouldn't be able to get away with. He even considers joining the Brotherhood, which Julia doesn't even believe in. All right, and that troubles Winston, but once again, Winston is just growing increasingly outward and bold in his rebellion as he attempts to make his life match his values. Okay, then O'Brien contacts Winston. All right, and O'Brien tells Winston that he should come to his house. O'Brien, this member of the inner party, this party higher up, who Winston's always thought maybe he wasn't perfectly orthodox. Maybe he's a rebel in disguise like me. O'Brien invites him to meet with him, where he will, quote unquote, show him this cool new Newspeak dictionary. But really, they're going to discuss Winston and Julia's induction into the Brotherhood. Okay. Winston explains to Julia in the next chapter that he feels responsible for killing his mother and sister. It's a memory that he has, a repressed memory from his youth, and he begins sharing that with Julia, which is just another act of intimacy, okay? An act of sort of emotional connectivity and emotional intimacy, not just physical intimacy. Winston and Julia's relationship is becoming emotionally and spiritually intimate as he shares some of these like deeply held fears and sufferings that he has, which is, as we learned from Frankenstein, a really important part of an intimate relationship, okay, true vulnerability, all right? They believe that they're going to get caught, right? He continues thinking about the fact that we're probably going to get caught, but they affirm something. They say, our rebellion still will be worth it, will still be cogent, will still be victorious, if even when they arrest us and torture us and make us say all kinds of things that we don't mean, if we continue to love one another in our private hearts, then we'll win. Because they want totalitarian control, and as long as our private hearts are free, then we are still free. Okay? Winston and Julia in Chapter 8 then meet with O'Brien, who inducts them into the Brotherhood, informing them that it is real and that Emmanuel Goldstein is alive, and that they can help in undermining the power of the party. Then O'Brien promises to give Winston a copy of the book, all right, which was a text written by Goldstein that explains the party's insanity and explains how the revolution against the party's power should take place. Okay, so this is a big deal for Winston because it's obviously a record of someone speaking against the party, of offering an alternative reality, of challenging their power, which illustrates the fact that the party is not, as Winston has feared and been trained to believe, omnipotent and everlasting. All right, so we'll get into an analysis of those important pieces of text later tomorrow, but as for today, we've completed our SQ3R. We returned to OTN 4 briefly, reviewed the main idea. So beef up your notes on OTN 4, make sure those are clear, make sure you understand the significance of Julie and Winston's love affair and the ways in which they begin to delight in one another, to love one another, to take pleasure in one another's companionship, and that is an act of freedom that rebels against the party's totalitarian tyrannical control. Then in parts 2, chapters 4 through 8, obviously Winston and Julia's relationship develops, becomes increasingly rebellious, and then eventually gets them connected to O'Brien, where they will externalize their rebellion even further. All right, have an excellent day. Hope you guys are well.